we've got a work session scheduled today on coal ash, and I'm going to turn that over to Mr. Wood to introduce our guests and explain to us what we're going to hear today.
Well, we have Dr. Fry with us, and we're delighted to have you with us. And we thought she could shed some light on it. Obviously, she's got a tremendous number of credentials. I won't go into all of that. I think you're going to cover that on one of your slides. Okay, we'll just let you do that. But we're delighted to have you with us, and we appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Should I get started?
Yes, we'll turn it right over to you.
Great. Well, I am really pleased to be here. I was invited by David Madden, who I met a few months ago. We were both in attendance at the North Carolina Public Health Association meeting, and I had given a talk there, and he came up to me after the talk, introduced himself, and said he would really love to think about ways that we could partner, because some of what I'll talk to you about, as I'm sure you're aware, we have some complex environmental issues in the state that influence all of us. And I think we do need, as the title of my slide conveys, we need to build these academic, community, and government partnerships to ensure and improve public health. So I am an associate professor at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm in the School of Public Health, the Gilling School of Global Public Health. I also direct our research, Superfund research program, and I'll talk to you about what that means. And in fact, it's through that program that Kathleen Gray, who's here with me, and I are basically fulfilling our obligation through funding that's given to us by the National Institute of Health. So as part of our funding, we are tasked with making sure to help communities who are in need. So I'll talk about that program. I also I'm a biologist by training. I have great expertise in metals toxicology, so I'm a member of the curriculum in toxicology. I'm a member of the Society of Toxicology. I'm currently vice president-elect of the metals specialty section. So metals is my area of expertise, and I'll talk to you about some of what the research that I've done. But more importantly than the research, I think in this context is how we have partnered over the years with individuals, whether that's communities or governments, to try to solve the environmental issues that we face. Some of my own expertise and some of what I've published I've highlighted in this slide, and I'll talk to you about a few of these examples. In partnership with Kathleen Gray, with Mina Sheehy, with others in the Department of Health and Human Services, including Ken Rudo, we worked over a multi-year project that was funded by the National Institutes of Health to understand and map contaminants across the state that were in private wells. And so I'll show you some of those results. And as we know, one of the complexities that we have in North Carolina is that we do have naturally occurring metals and elements that exist because of our unique geology. We have, also a passion of mine is understanding and protecting children from the harms of environmental toxicants. And let me just say, I'm a professor, but I also, research is a major mission of what we do at UNC Chapel Hill. And so this picture is actually showing you some of my lab members. So I have postdoctoral researchers, I have graduate students, I have PhD students, I have master's students. And so that picture just shows you some of my lab who tend to work on these research questions that we have. In partnership with the state lab, I also worked with Leslie Wolf at the time, who was the director of the state lab, to show that we had some instances where pregnant women in North Carolina were being exposed to toxic metals. In some of those women, the measurements that we saw exceeded guidelines. So really one of the big pushes I make research-wise is thinking about how we can protect vulnerable populations. And one of the most vulnerable populations we have are developing infants. So a lot of my research focuses around that. And a major mission really is to understand how toxic metals can influence human health, because if we understand how, we may actually be able to come up with solutions to protect us. I wanted to highlight that I've been doing metals research for almost 2 decades now, and I was brought into this research, believe it or not, by the Princess of Thailand. The Princess of Thailand, I've circled there, Ranphabun, Thailand. And this map actually shows you areas that are highlighted around the world where arsenic contaminates drinking water. So this is an issue. It's an issue in North Carolina. It's an issue in New Hampshire. It's an issue in New Mexico. An issue all over the U.S. as well as around the globe. And so the Princess of Thailand is a scientist and was concerned about arsenic contaminating the drinking water in Ranphabun, Thailand, and came to MIT, where I was doing my postdoc, and wanted to partner with my mentor and I to understand, first of all, how much the infants were being exposed to, so that's called a biomonitoring study, and also one of my areas of expertise has to do with genes and transcripts, and so we looked to see which biological pathways were being changed in these infants. And so I wanted to highlight just that we have worked in the context of some very big environmental issues globally. And then this map is one of the figures that was published in 2012. Sanders is the first author. That's my former graduate student, Allie Sanders. And I'm the senior author on that paper. And then again, this was a partnership with the Department of Health and Human Services, where we had expertise at UNC to help to look and see if there were geospatial patterns of arsenic that was detectable in private wells. And one of the patterns that was known by many, but I think this publication has really helped to raise awareness about this, is that the Piedmont area, which is also sometimes called the Slate Belt of North Carolina, or the central part of the state, has a geology that can result in naturally occurring arsenic, inorganic arsenic. And so one of the things that we did was to help the DHHS to map these data, to understand counties where we may have this potential for exposure. So in this map, the areas that are darker gray or black are the areas where we found the most number of wells that had inorganic arsenic. We found almost 1,500 wells that exceeded the EPA guidelines for arsenic, hundreds that exceeded 50 parts per billion, and the maximum that we saw was 800 parts per billion, which is, it's a very high level of arsenic. And so some of what we do now is try to make sure that individuals who are on private wells know where they can have their wells tested, and that we can help them interpret what the results mean. And we have already begun to do that in the context of some of the issues that we may or may not talk about today. Lots of folks need help in understanding what the well reports mean, and we can help with that.
Excuse me, am I understanding you say that in Wayne County there were 60 wells that
Yes.
were tested or found out?
Yes, 60 wells, yes, 60 wells that were tested, and then the color would indicate that it was on the higher end. And that the color is an average of the data points that are there. So we have, I had shown you the map of arsenic. We went back into the data set to look at whether there were other metals that might be naturally occurring or not naturally occurring but present in the environment. And so again, one of the areas of expertise that we brought to the table was the analytics to map these geospatially. And then in this paper, we partnered with the North Carolina Birth Defects Monitoring Program to see if we saw any association between these toxic metals and birth defects, which we know from animal models and from population studies, there's the potential for that relationship. What I'm showing you here are the maps again. At this time they're shown in greater, finer resolution. And one of the features that we saw that's actually known to occur, this situation occurs in Bangladesh and other areas around the world, is that manganese actually co-occurs with arsenic. And so you can see that in the map in the A part of the figure and the C part of the figure, that the areas that are darkest for arsenic and manganese are similar. And so what this means is if you're in an area where arsenic may be very elevated, it's also likely because of the geology that you may have elevated levels of manganese. We performed an association study with the birth defects data, and this is called an ecologic study, which means that we track birth defects patterns across the state, but we don't have an environmental sample that's been collected from that infant. And so the ecologic study means that you take one data set, you overlay on top of it another data set. And what we showed was a statistical trend for areas where manganese was high. There was a trend for increased prevalence of a specific type of heart defect. So that type of study has limitations, but it is one of the areas that I would really love to see us thinking about in North Carolina, is making sure that we are, first of all, tracking any potential health effects, but even more basic than that, understanding some of the levels of these metals that might occur in drinking wells. And we know that the issue with drinking wells is that they are not regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency. And so, again, we have complex issues here in North Carolina because of our geology. So I had mentioned that not only am I faculty at the School of Public Health, but I now have the great honor and privilege of being the director of UNC's Superfund Research Program. And so I wanted to talk to you just for a minute about the broader NIEHS Superfund Research Program. So that NIEHS stands for the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. And the NIEHS is one of the divisions of the NIH that focuses on environmental agents. And I've just described it there, but this research program was launched 25 years ago. The director of it is Bill Sook. And the mission of these programs is to fund universities for multidisciplinary research. So I've already talked about, for us to work with the DHHS and look at these trends across the state, we needed to bring in a whole lot of expertise. We needed to bring in metals toxicology, we needed to bring in geospatial patterning, and for the Birth Defects Association, we needed to bring in epidemiologists. So our goal, the larger goal of this program, is to understand the relationship between environmental issues, exposure to hazardous substances, and the potential for health effects. And one of our goals is not simply to understand those relationships academically, but to potentially prevent exposures where we can. So here is a diagram of the structure of our program. As I said, I am the director of our center, and I have a deputy director, that's Mike Aiken, who is the chair of the Department of Environmental Sciences and Engineering. We have 5 different research projects that focus on different things, one of those being risk analysis, one of those being arsenic and links to diabetes, my own, which is metals and reproductive or developmental toxicities. And then we have projects that focus on sophisticated methods for advanced detection of chemicals in the environment. And then one that is one of the missions, as I said, of the Superfund Research Program. Can you actually remove? Can you, if you can identify that there's a problem, can we do something about it? And ideally, we work actively at contaminated sites. Those could be Superfund, but they can also be other types of sites as well. We also have I think one of the greatest parts of the center, we have a research translation and community engagement core. So as I said, these are missions that are given to us by the National Institute of Health. We are tasked with translating our research. So actually, what I'm doing today is research translation. I'm talking to you about some of the research that we've done, and hopefully we'll get your feedback about how we can use that information to better the lives of people in North Carolina. And then we have a community engagement core, and that community engagement core was called by individuals in various parts of North Carolina asking for help. In some cases, understanding what well results mean, who they could talk to about having their wells tested, or just some of the questions that a lot of people ask. And we would love to hear from you if there are other ways that we can partner with you to help and be facilitators in, as I've said, a very complex geography and environmental scenario that we have here. So the research that we do focuses on some examples I've given you here, evaluating risks even from low-level exposures, developing biomarkers so that we could identify if someone's been exposed to a contaminant, identifying mechanisms. And so again, if we understand mechanisms, if there's the situation where we either can't do something about the exposure or it's too late to do something about the exposure, we can perhaps understand the pathways or what has happened in the body physiologically so that we could do something about it. One of the most complicated factors that we have is that everyone is different in terms of how they process their exposures to contaminants, and so that ideas that we can have various susceptibilities, and human health effects are obviously a combination of what you're exposed to, whether that's a single contaminant, very rarely, or mixtures of contaminants, when you've been exposed, your genetics, your nutrition. All of this comes into play in figuring out and determining individual risk, which is a very complicated factor. And then, as I had said, we also work on improving our methods to measure these exposures in the environment. So I'm going to switch now to talk a little bit about toxic metals, many of which we study in the context of the Superfund Research Program. So I'm going to talk just basically about some of the metals that we may be faced with in various parts of the state. Arsenic, cadmium, hexavalent chromium, lead, mercury, vanadium. When we have toxic metals, they serve no useful purpose in the body. Unlike essential metals, which we need. So there are some metals that we actually need for our cells to behave appropriately, but toxic metals are not those. And if we have chronic exposure or exposures at certain levels, there's the potential for detrimental health effects. One of the resources that we use, and the resource that I use to put together some of this information, is the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. This is a great resource for people. And so, for example, if a community comes to us and says, I want to know what's the potential health effects of being exposed to inorganic arsenic, or how much has to be there before I need to be worried, this is a really great resource to provide to people, and is an example of the type of information that we can provide to community members. And so I think a lot of what we would like to do in this partnership is figure out what the questions are and find solutions, and some of those solutions may just be as simple as that, providing resources to individuals. So some of the health effects that you're likely well aware of for the different metals are shown here. I wanted to highlight, though, that there certainly is the potential for differences in susceptibility based on whether we're talking about adults and their metabolism of toxic substances or children. Children may have unique potential for exposure because they play in the soil and they put their fingers in their mouths and they do things that adults don't necessarily do. And so that can change the levels that they're exposed to, and then because their bodies aren't fully grown, their metabolism may not be, and likely is not, at the level of an adult. And so that can certainly influence susceptible time frames of exposure. So we're here to talk about some of the complexities of coal ash, and this is a potential source of toxic metals. So as you can see, my experience with toxic metals is how I became involved in coal ash. I was actually asked to come shortly after the coal ash spill in the town of Eden to talk to the town council. It felt very much like this. I came and talked about the hazards associated with the toxic metals in coal ash, and the town council actually needed my help because they were trying to figure out how to deal with some of the regulations around where the coal ash was being placed. And so the science that we brought to the table helped them to make decisions about what they were going to do and decisions that they were going to make. So we know that coal ash is the waste material that's left over after coal is burned, and this can contain many of the metals that I've been talking about. We have potential releases into the environment. In that case, we had the spill. We can also have blowing, leaching into storage, leaching from storage units that can happen, influencing the levels of toxics that would be either in air, land, or water. For some of these metals that we're talking about, they can bioaccumulate, and so that means that they build up. They can build up in organisms. So for example, methyl mercury, which is the example that I've given here, can be consumed by fish, and then if we eat the fish, we're exposed to that methyl mercury in what the fish consumed. And so this is particularly important for us to consider in some communities where fishing becomes a major food source for a family. And so some of our activities in the center are focused on, are there areas where people might be fishing, but they may not know that those are contaminated with chemicals like PCBs. And so part of what we do, again, for the communication side and our task by the NIH is to provide fact sheets for individuals in the community that say, here are certain fish that would be safer for you to eat, and here are certain fish that, given this environmental scenario, you might want to avoid. So again, it's not saying we're going to be able to clean everything up, but it's making sure that communities are aware of the potential exposure sources and making the right decisions based on that information. So drinking water standards are set by the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act and National Primary Drinking Water Regulations. And I'm showing you here a comparison of some of the drinking water standards for some of these toxic metals that we've been talking about based on the U.S. standards versus North Carolina standards, and some of those differ. For example, there's a difference between the U.S. Standard for chromium and the North Carolina standard for chromium, 100 parts per billion versus 0.05 parts per billion. But then I've noted at the bottom that the 0.07 parts per billion standard is based on a review of the literature corresponding to a 1 in a million lifetime cancer risk level. So I wanted to talk about this for just a minute. I wasn't, again, not entirely certain what questions folks might have for me, but I wanted to talk about this. So if we look at cancer risk, or an estimated excess lifetime cancer risk, if we wanted to talk about what 1 in 10,000 means, 1 in 10,000 means that one person out of 10,000 equally exposed would contract cancer if exposed continuously, 24 hours per day, to that concentration over 70 years. And the risk would be the excess cancer risk that's in addition to any cancer risk borne by a person who's not exposed. And so I'm contrasting these two guidance levels that are set by the US EPA. And I wanted to highlight that level of excess cancer risk that we determine in the United States or globally is a matter of personal, community, and regulatory judgment. So an example, if you look at 1 in a million, which is the risk that I'm describing on the left, so the EPA considers excess cancer risks below 1 chance in a million to be so small as to be negligible. So that's below 1 chance in a million. And then 1 in 10,000. EPA considers excess risks that are above 1 chance in 10,000 to be sufficiently large that remediation is desirable. So you have these two extremes, the 1 in a million and the 1 in 10,000. And those cancer risks, in many cases, determine whether or not, for example, for Superfund sites, someone takes action for cleanup. These two numbers are very standard bounds for risk levels. So what I mean is these are commonly used global criteria for protecting individuals from the risks of toxic substances. So what are we here to do? As I've said, our mission and what we are tasked with, and I will also say the NIEHS is actually located here. So NIEHS and the director of the Superfund Research Program lives in North Carolina, and so we also have a very unique connection to the larger program. And I didn't say that there are 18 funded Superfund centers that are based at different universities. Duke University currently has one as well. The director of that is Rich DiGiulio. But what can we do and how can we partner with the complex situation that we have in front of us? We can provide assistance to communities as well as to local governments with some of these here, and we could expand this depending on what the needs are. For example, help with information on where and how to seek water testing. So a lot of questions we've gotten are, I think, a result of response to information that people have seen in the news and not knowing where to go. So they may hear that there's the potential for exposure, may not know if they are, their water source and what they should do. We can help provide them with that information on where and how much it costs and how you manage that. Assistance in interpreting results. We're already doing this. We're helping people to understand, well, the levels that they see, and if their reports have not or have exceeded the current guidelines, helping them to see which of the contaminants that happen, and then talking through some of the complex issues of thinking about health risks. And so that's the later one, understanding potential health risks. And as I said earlier, health risks are a complex, multifactorial biology, genetics environment, and timing of exposure. So what might be less toxic for an adult man might be more toxic for a developing fetus, and there's lots of information to suggest that's the case. And then assistance with solutions if their water is contaminated. So again, I think there are lots of ways that we can partner, and we really do want to hear from you all about the questions that you might have, how we can help. I know David had described it seeming in the past few months slightly overwhelming, and our task, as mandated through the National Institute of Health, is to be able to help, and so that's why we're here. I've put my contact information, and I'm happy to take questions now from the commissioners. So.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions? Mr. Mayo.
Yes, I have a couple, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Fry, for coming and sharing with us. I wanted to go back to the first, I guess, the arsenic contamination in the waters of North Carolinians. And I'm just a layperson,
yes.
So when I look at this, I see Wayne County sticking out in the middle of a lot of counties that are not as contaminated as we are, And I was wondering, is this something that you might know that is natural, or could this be something that's happened because something has changed in our environment?
So let me say a couple caveats about our study, and they relate to regulations for private well testing. In our study, what we can do is look at the database that the DHHS maintained over a 10-year period, which does not include every possible private well in the state, because regulation doesn't require that that's tested. As a result of the regulations, we can only analyze what was in the DHHS database over that 10-year period. We also cannot say from the study the source of the arsenic, but we can tell from the patterns of the Piedmont that makes a lot of sense, that the counties that are along the central part of the state are likely contaminated because of, in part, geologically occurring. Now, could contamination that's occurring in other counties be from other sources? Yes, but our study really can't point to those. What I think we need is more active well monitoring, and I know all of these things cost money. More active well monitoring and measures of those potential other sources if we wanted to distinguish between potential exposure sources. I think the other piece that we need is, and it comes along with that active well monitoring, regardless of the source, if you are on a private well and your arsenic level exceeds EPA standards, we want to do something about it. So regardless of the source, that's right, a primary public health concern. So I hope that answered it in some way.
Yeah, I think without further information, but I really believe that monitoring the wells, because it still looks a little funny that we're not contiguous to any other county that has a high level of arsenic.
Yes.
So that just raises a flag on the layperson like myself.
Yes. So I agree. If we could, I would have active well monitoring of private wells in many of these counties.
I have a follow-up, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Commissioner Mayo.
Yeah, this is the last one. I think maybe you may have cleared it. I'm looking at the drinking water standards that the U.S. and North Carolina, and I think, including myself, I was told that the U.S. standard drinking water standards are tighter than North Carolina. But what I'm looking at on your chart, that's not the case. It's that, like vanadium, for example, we're actually calling for 0.3 parts per, is that billion?
Parts per billion,
Yeah,
correct.
but the U.S. doesn't even call for it.
That's correct.
Monitoring.
For some of these, we are being extremely public health protective, and
Yeah, and so the rest of the items, other than the chromium, which you pointed out, the rest of the items are the same
that is true.
at the federal and the state level. So there's a misconception out there that the U.S. standards are tighter than the North Carolina standards, and I want the public to make sure they understand that according to your information, that is not true.
We are being public health protective from these guidelines, from these standards.
Thank you.
Commissioner Cromartie.
Well, I was trying to glean exactly what Mr. Mayo was and talking about. Here's Wayne County sitting there, and no county that's connected to us is shaded in. Am I asking wrong? Is that a direct relationship? The fact we have coal ash?
So
I mean,
we
I don't know what
we cannot say that from this study. We can't say that because.
Well, let me ask a different question. Can someone tell me how many counties right around us have coal ash ponds?
So I think if we wanted to, I think these are good questions to ask, which is, are wells that are proximal to coal ash, do they have higher levels? Those studies that's not what this study does. And I think that's a really good question.
If I could I follow up on?
Please go ahead, maybe I'm not asking the right question.
I think it all depends upon where the location of those 60 wells are within Wayne County. I mean, that has a whole lot to do with it.
Yes.
If in fact those are in the northern part around Eureka, or are they
Yes.
in Grantham, or where is the location of the 60
Yes.
test wells?
Yes. Now, I do have to say that the issue is complicated in North Carolina because of the geology. And so one of the individuals who we have, scientists who is part of our center, is Avner Van Gosh. He's at Duke, but he has a way through isotopic measurements to distinguish between coal ash-derived contaminants and non-coal ash-derived contaminants. So I think what I'm hearing from you is a major question that you would like answered is, are the patterns that you're seeing for toxic metals in private wells, are they coal ash related or not?
That's correct.
Well,
Okay.
that's a $64,000
Okay.
question.
But to truly answer that well, we have to do more studies. We have to do more studies of wells and use these isotopic measurements. I wish we could answer that, although, like I said, from the public health standpoint, if someone has elevated arsenic in their well, there is a public health concern regardless of source. But I hear you, and I think there are ways, potentially through our center, that we can find funding through partnerships to try to answer some of these questions.
But let me ask real quick.
Go ahead, Commissioner Martin.
As we look at the center part of the state where the counties are dark gray and black, is there evidence or information to tell us that there are more coal ash sites in those areas, therefore contributing to the dark gray and the black? And if that's the case, old country boy like myself would just start connecting dots, say, if there's a relationship in that area other than geography. And I realize that just traveling up through that area, it looks like the land becomes more clay looking than
Right.
the sand we have down here.
Right.
So I understand that there could be some relationship to the geography of it, and all that kind of thing. And when you mentioned about babies playing in the sand and getting it in the mouth, I'm from Cumberland County. There used to be a few sites in Cumberland County where ladies would go and find and eat clay. I never tasted it of myself, but I know that was a practice. That some of you shaking your head out there. I know you know what I'm talking about. So my closing is that if wells are located in those areas where it's dark, we have a dark spot. If we have coal ash ponds and they have it. I mean, I know we're talking about high level science that we may not understand, but to me it looks like there may be some relationship, and I was wondering who can speak to that.
So I think one of the things that we could do, I'm going to ask Kathleen if she could pull up quickly the location of the
Okay.
coal ash
Thank
plants,
you.
and then you and I could look at it together. As you're saying, it wouldn't, we could look for patterns. The pattern that's strongest in our study really is the Piedmont and the geology, which isn't to say that industry sources can't contribute to some extent, even in those areas where it's naturally occurring. So as I say, we have complex issues in the state, but the way I think, my perspective of how we can think about this is, if you have an individual who's living, especially the individual who's on 800 parts per billion, number one, are they aware? Number two, do they know, should we monitor these over time and look at consistency? Number three, do they have access to some alternate water source? And those are, they're really big public health questions. And I hear you, and I think we would really love to figure out ways to answer these questions, because we all have these questions.
Commissioner Haycock.
The question I have, I know you can't answer it. Chip might be the only one in the room that can, and I'm not sure he even can. Do we have any numbers or percentages on how many households are still on private wells in Wayne County?
quite a few more than 60.
I
Yeah,
knew
so
that, but I was just curious to, you know.
So we have the opportunity, I would like to, share with you some positive news or positive way that we could think about this. We will be putting in our competing renewal. So what that means is you write a grant, and if you do a good job in your grant, you may be funded again. But the granting situation is very, very competitive. We have the possibility with our competitive renewal to think about projects that can address really important questions in North Carolina. We have been approached by the community to try and help answer some of these questions, and I would love to do that. What I'm saying is we can apply to the NIH under this mechanism to try to get some funds to answer some of these questions. And if we do it all together, all in partnership, it'll be much better, and the questions and the answers that we can give will help all of us to understand the issues. And one of those issues to me is, are the people who are drinking from private wells, what's the state of contamination in those wells? We need the data there first. Then the second question is, can we differentiate in those wells between naturally occurring and coal ash derived? And through the science in our center, we can do that. Can't do it today because I don't have the data from this county, but we can do it through that mechanism that I'm talking about. And so, as I said, this is why we are funded by the NIH, to do exactly this. And I think it's a great opportunity for us. And we can answer those questions probably in about a year's time. We would have the data in front of us that we could really say, here are the data, here's what they show, here's, depending on how many wells there are in the county, we could really do broader coverage than we certainly have now, which again is limited by what was in the DHHS database.
Commissioner Mayor.
If you, when you do a study, do you have any contact or with Diener here in North Carolina?
Yes, we would for this. We
Okay.
would make sure to talk to them and hopefully get their buy-in for this, yeah.
Okay, so there is on the Diener website some information about some contaminated wells that have been tested. But, I'm not so sure that that's to be taken at face value. What I would like to see is you do a study that just backs up or differentiates whatever someone else has come up with. Because this is too important of an issue to the citizens that are affected in these areas for us not to do whatever it takes to make sure we get it right the first time, because we need to get it right the first time.
Mm-hmm.
So I would encourage a study that would work together to try to make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Mr. Wood.
I just have a couple of questions. One is, were y'all involved at all in the study? And I think it was required by Diener, as I read the settlement and everything, that Duke was to pay for it, but Diener required a certain studies were done, and specifically they came up with limitations within certain areas. I think it was 1,500 linear feet from wells. Is that right? So I guess my question is, were y'all involved in that? And if not, are you privy to it? Has your group read the study?
So we were not involved in it. That was, DEQ, as I understand it.
Is that old Diener?
Yes,
Diener.
yes, Diener has a new name,
Okay.
yes, which is DEQ.
Well, I just want to make sure we're
Yes,
saying
yes,
something.
we're talking about the same group. I will confess that I have looked on their website and I'm trying to understand where the wells were tested, how many wells, how many exceeded. And I've had my student pull down all the data, and I'm looking to see how many were tested and how many exceeded and what they exceeded for. And that's what I mean. I agree with you, Commissioner, that even that is just sort of a drop in the bucket of a few wells, and it doesn't really give us the data that we need to get to this issue. And so we need to test. I will say, yes, I believe that all of those data are publicly available. And we could help to look at it all together. I'd be happy to come back, in a few months, and we could look and see what's available already before, we could potentially do something greater. And, I really think what I would love to hear from you is, we would have to figure out the costs of, how many wells are we talking about? How do we get access to those wells? So the logistic of people actually giving us some well samples. We can take on the measurements, and so I would need to come up with the budget for doing that and make sure that it falls within the constraints of the grant. But we would love to partner with you to answer these questions because, as you say, the ones that have been sampled represent only a few, and we are right. We're academics. We're neutral to all of that, but we have all the technological capabilities to be able to measure them similarly. So.
Well, I think one of the things that a number of people in the community would be interested in was DEQ's methodology right? In other words, in layman's terms, is 1,500 feet the right measurement? We're all lay people, so we don't know.
Okay.
But I would like to know that.
Okay.
If y'all think that the methodology that DEQ basically required that the people going out and doing that study had to conform to, we'd like to know your assessment of whether that methodology is right.
Okay.
And if so, was enough done, or does more need to be done?
Okay. I would be happy to dig in more, look at all of the data, look at how they measured. As I'm aware, they had some initial tests that did not differentiate between total chromium and hexavalent chromium, but they sent them out to a different testing body that did do the hexavalent chromium. But I would be interested in putting those data together and coming back and presenting it to you all so that at least we could see what information we do have. And then we could also, perhaps at that time, maybe we could talk more about, specific questions and bigger picture questions that you'd like to address in the county and how we can work together potentially to apply for some funding to do it.
Commissioner Mayo.
I think the county manager has made a good point. From my understanding, one of the biggest concerns in that area is that 1,500 feet, in most people's mind, don't get it for this reason. That area flooded back when we had the big flood, the 22 inches of rain years ago. The area did flood. So the key is that what's outside of that 1,500 feet? And the other question is that I'm not sure, I think I'm correct, somewhere around 4 wells, 6 wells or something of that nature, according to the DENR website, was tested. Is that a representative sample that we need to do?
I think it was everyone within that circle, if I remember.
I think that's right. They've tested all within the 1,500 feet, and then some of them had exceedances. But some of their exceedances were not necessarily arsenic or hexavalent chromium. They might have exceeded for other reasons. And so again, we could, I'd be happy to compile the data that's available to us and help think through what it means for people. Okay. And then we can talk about, was that size big enough? Is that public health protective? Or are we missing a whole lot of people who are potentially exposed that didn't get captured in the 1,500 feet? Those are really good questions, and I hear what you want to do is protect the health of the people who live here. So.
Well, we do. We fully recognize, though, that we're preempted by state.
Yes.
Because this is not an issue a county commission can take, and argue with Duke. It's been settled, and it's being done by a state agency. We recognize that, but I do think we have some concerns. And I know some of the folks do about whether this is adequate or not.
Okay. And like I said, that's what we're here for. You know, we might not be able to do, based on the cost, we might not be able to do everything, but we can put the budget together and we can think about what we could do. And, you know, like I said, I think, you know, a year from now is probably a good time to have some really strong data in front of us. Gives us time to figure out how we're going to sample, how we're going to get the well water. Are people going to give us buy-in and help us with the sample collection? That's actually a major limitation here, is just getting communities on board to provide us with some samples that we can test. Yeah.
If I could, while we're on that topic, I think there has been some discussion. I'm going to ask either our county attorney or our county manager to express that. And there was some discussion in regards to our position in this whole issue of the coal ash and the state's position in the coal ash. And you all used some legal technical word that was beyond my scope of understanding. So maybe you could explain that.
I think the word that manager used was preemption, and when the state or federal government, if the federal government can put in all the rules, that means nobody else can. And if the state, they allow the state to put some in, and on one of the pages on the drinking water standards, you had the USNMC, and I think Commissioner Mayer mentioned that it shows clearly that the state is at least as strong as the U.S. on all of them, and stronger on some of them. But the state does preempt the field. There's not any way that the county can go in and say we're going to have arsenic at 5 ppbs. That's done now. If the county wants to cooperate with Dr. Fry's group to try to do something and help with getting samples, that would be something that the county might do.
Well, to clarify it a little bit more, and that is, the concern was that the state basically passed the legislation which indicated how the entire coal ash matter would be handled. And we can't interfere with that. That has been basically mandated by the state.
That's correct.
Okay. But at the same time, what we're interested in is finding some way to alleviate some concerns that our citizens have. And I want to put this properly. I'm not trying to say that we don't trust Duke's testing, but I hear that in the community, and that is that Duke hired the company that came in and ran the testing. Now, they were mandated to do that. Let's make sure we understand that. But there is some question as to whether or not those results are accurate. I'm trying to pick my words carefully. It's hard to do, but at any rate. So with bringing you in, it would be an enormous help to our community of having a person that didn't have a dog in the fight to come in and analyze and let us know truly where we stand. I think that's kind of where we're at.
We would love to partner with you. We have the capacity to measure these things. We have the energy and the interest to do so, and we have no dog in the fight.
Well, and we would just,
my job is to be a scientist,
sure,
and to look at the data and
we
to
would
present
just,
it.
yeah, we would just encourage you to get the grant, whatever. Yes. And if you need to partner with us to pass resolutions and assist you in any way, we certainly would be more than willing to do that, because our community is just eager for some knowledge.
Yes. Yes.
Is basic. Yes, Commissioner Miller.
Are you privy to gain the data from DEQ?
I believe that we can. I believe that it should be all publicly
And
available.
then being a third party to analyze and give us some suggestions or recommendations?
Now, I can certainly look at what they did, and I can look at the groups that analyze the data, and I can report back to you after I've done that.
And I think that would help the
Absolutely.
community.
Now again, the one issue still is that if there only a few wells were captured in that radius, there's still this bigger question. And I think that's what we've heard from the community as well. You know, well, they're here and I'm here, and could my water be contaminated, and where do I go, and how do I get my, and I wasn't captured in the 1500, and maybe my well. So there's a lot of fear, and I actually think, the fear itself can do harm to public health.
Sure.
And so the more that we can resolve that by saying, if you want to have your well tested, we can help you. We can do that. I think there is an issue here of a lot of fear. And so, having the data will really help us. And so,
I
yes,
agree.
we can do that.
I agree.
Mr. Chairman, if I could suggest, David has a chemistry background, I don't.
Nor do I.
And I would suggest that maybe let me get him involved and perhaps the three of us sit down and
That'd be
kind
great.
of thrash this thing out.
And I think one thing that would help me is if you could all put together, maybe even now, right after we talk, if you have questions, if you have big concerns and maybe smaller questions, can we write them down and get them all into your hands so that I make sure that I know exactly what you want and that we are, trying to ask for exactly what you need and the information that you need when we put in our competing renewal.
And that's why I want to have the meeting
Yeah.
with him.
Yeah.
And we can
Yeah.
do all of that together.
Well, I was serious close. I
Commissioner
thought that your partner was gonna show us a map or something that would show where all the coal ponds were currently located.
So I did pull up a map, and there are certainly some of the coal facilities do track along where these higher levels of arsenic, but they're in other places too. So there's no
And let me ask this follow-up real quick. I see there's Wayne County, and there's a couple other counties, maybe that's Lenore or Onslow, but and the question I want to know if there were coal ash ponds over that way.
No.
There's
So-
not, yes or no?
So
And then-
Commissioner, when I come back, I'm
Okay.
going to overlay these data for you.
All right.
Because I hear your
Okay,
question.
because the question, here's what I was getting at. You said something earlier about how fish could be carriers of this. My mind immediately comes to the Neuse River, and I know people, I don't fish in the Neuse River. I don't fish, wish I did. But I was just wondering if there might be innocent folk out there fishing in the Neuse River. And my colleague here mentioned the great floods we had, and there was a relationship between that water running that way. I'm just plain old concerned that our colleagues might be fishing in ponds that maybe they need to be warned to stop fishing. I mean, I know we're
Okay.
talking about a study that might be a year old,
Okay.
but I don't want them fishing the day of next
Okay.
week when they may not need to be fishing.
Okay.
Let's not go too far here, yeah.
Well, I'm just saying.
Okay, I hear you. We're
Follow up
gonna-
on that, if it was that, then it couldn't just skip Lenore County because of.
Well, now,
So
listen,
you gotta-
okay, that's it.
I thought the same thing when I
Well,
first looked at it.
when you're talking about, and I'm not a pro about water either, but I do know for a fact, my grandmom used to find water with a stick, but the water runs underground, and it might just miss in the county. That's what I was thinking about, Mr. Payton. It might have missed that county, but the stream might have taken on the ground for a while, and it might be the reason it missed it.
All right, I think
Commissioner-
we're digressing
Well,
here.
I would like to say one thing related to fish consumption advisories. In our Superfund research program, we are doing work with DHHS and colleagues at NC State around fish consumption advisories, not related to coal ash, but, we have statewide advisories for mercury, and then we have site-specific advisories. And we are working with some of the communities that have contamination to help identify more effective ways to communicate about fish consumption advisories. So, if in the future we find there's a relationship with coal ash, we certainly are already thinking about how people get information on fish consumption as part of the work we do together.
Sure. Well, Dr. Fry, I want to thank you so much for taking your time to come down here. I think you can see that our community has got some questions.
Yes.
And it's good that we've got an individual and a resource that we as a community can tend to and seek out to come and answer some of these questions. And you're right, I think it is a lot to do with some fear. And if I were living in that area, I'd have some fear too. I mean,
Yes.
because I may not know the information.
Yes.
So information is key here.
Yes.
So we would hope that the county manager and yourself and David Madden can find a way to bring that resource here to get us some information.
Well, we are happy to partner with you.
Okay, great. Thank you
And
so
you said
much.
your contact information is in here,
The very last
the
slide.
very last page.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay, is there anything further to bring before the Board of Commissioners? If not,